Intuition and instinct. Let's have a little conversation about those two. Instinct, also known as your gut feeling, is a physiological response experienced in the body. It's an experience that is typically based on survival, which is often an avoidance of fear or an avoidance of danger, right? It's an extremely beneficial instinct for the physiological organism of the body. Intuition is something else entirely. Intuition is something that you perceive. Feel is not even quite the right word. It's something that you perceive in your being. You can't point to it because it's non-local. It's also not a belief. It's a knowing. It's a calm, peaceful, silent knowing that does not need to be right, doesn't need to prove any points. It's just there. It's just present. Very many times in our day-to-day life, we experience differing usages of both versions, both the gut instinct, wired to survival, and intuition, wired to spirit, and spirit with a capital S, and the larger scheme of capital R reality. It's a challenging conversation to have because it is such a subjective conversation. If I were to ask a person who has not yet really invested any time into the spiritual path, into their own spiritual development, at least in this lifetime, they might swear up and down that it's intuition, what they're feeling, because to them, being so invested in the body, the gut instinct is so powerful and so essential. It feels like it must be something higher. It must be something real. And so they will look at you with a great depth of sincerity, and they would be telling the truth. They would be telling their truth. That the thing they're feeling that is actually gut instinct is intuition. It isn't. It's gut instinct. But to them, it's so real that they would be able to speak very convincingly. Does this make them a liar? No, not at all, because it is their truth. However, does this mean that their gut instinct is actually intuition? Also no. In the same way that in almost any video game, if you've played any of them, there are unlockables as you go through the game. The spiritual path is not dissimilar in this way, that you unlock skills as you progress. Another way, a more physics-based way of speaking of this is as your vibration changes, or put another way, as your vibration elevates, you gain access to ideas, concepts, abilities that you didn't even know were an option at lower levels. And so in that same way, to go back to our initial example of this person swearing that their gut instinct is intuition, this is why they can look at you and be speaking their truth. Because they do not yet, from their space, they do not yet have access to the very real process of intuition. The challenge here is acknowledging the person, acknowledging their truth, without coming off as judgmental. That can be a tough thing to do in some moments, when you know that what they're saying is technically not the fullness of truth. But when they're in a position where this is the fullest truth that they're able to comprehend, does that make it the fullest truth? For them, sure. From their perspective, yes. What do we do in those moments? What's the inspiration to do in those moments? What's the right way to be in those moments? Is it your job to fix them? Is it your job to make them see the light? Is it your job to tell them they're small and that when they're bigger, they'll be able to sense this? Look into the answers that just came up. Whatever your answers were, just look at them. Analyze them. Ask if there's any ego, spiritual or otherwise, hiding in any of those answers. Any desire to be right, any desire to prove a point, any insecurity about whether or not the perspective that you have is correct. A little bit of, is there any need for a little bit of validation? Just ask. And then based on what that answer is, send all of your attention to your heart. All of it. And focus all of your energy in the center of the love of you. And aim that light, that love, that energy, aim that light at yourself. So if that's gut instinct, let's talk a little bit about intuition. If you know what it is, if you've experienced it, you know what it is. And you know that it's different. It's less loud than instinct. Instinct is very insistent, whereas intuition is a whisper. It's a suggestion. It's something that is so easily blown past. In the beginning, you may even mistake it as, wait, surely that's not the answer. Not really, right? Often it's illogical. Often it's contralogical. Because it comes from a place that is nonlinear. Logic is very linear. Intuition is nonlinear. If it had to have any shape in our three-dimensional world, you would call it spherical. It's probably not even that. But in 3D, in 3 dimensions, it is a more spherical approach to looking at life. If this doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. That's okay. Just try to hear everything you can about that. What does make sense about that statement? And if it does make sense to you, what else does that suggest? If intuition is spherical. The idea behind sharing this was a little bit just to point out, to give you a small piece of understanding that you may have already had. So perhaps it's just to confirm that. But throughout our lives, we meet many people, some of whom use words and use language in many different ways. That was my dog. You good, buddy? And that's actually going to be the topic of our next video, is languages. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But to wrap this one up, the idea with this particular video was to walk you through an example of how, based on a person's vocabulary, they may be using the same word, in this case intuition, to mean two very different things. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Namaste.